August 1969. The disaffected Catholic population of the Bogside took to the streets to confront the Royal Ulster Constabulary in the wake of a Protestant apprentice boys' parade in the city. The violence, which was a manifestation of long-standing political grievances, was so extreme that in an unprecedented step, British troops were deployed into Derry. This decision by the British government under Prime Minister Harold Wilson was to shape the future of Northern Ireland for over 30 years.
They moved straight into one of the worst hit streets on the edge of the Bogside, carrying with them their ready-made barbed wire barricades and lining up in battle formation across the street where the air was foul with smoke and tear gas. The stones and petrol bombs ceased, and slowly the Bogside fighters approached the newly installed barbed wire barricades.
Using previously unseen archive footage, we reveal the inside story of what became known as the Battle of the Bogside. Northern Ireland, although part of the United Kingdom, had been ruled by a separate unionist government since 1921. Despite nationalists forming a significant majority in Derry, unionists manipulated the electoral system to secure power in local government and retain control of housing and employment. Nationalists blamed them for the widespread poverty and overcrowding in Catholic districts. In the months leading up to the battle, people had begun to take to the streets. They were demanding equality and democracy.
1968 was a remarkable year when there were outbreaks of disturbances and violence in so many countries. And in some ways, I think the Civil Rights Association that existed then, or was set up then in Derry, was an offshoot of the general sort of disturbance, an air of disturbance that existed in other parts of the world.
Ladies and gentlemen, I would certainly hope that in conducting this march in our city, that we will act in a responsible manner.
When the civil rights movement deepened, and suddenly there was a whiff of victory in the air when we went marching, and the unions tried to stop us, and the British ignored us, and the police were attacking us. There was a feeling that we were going to overturn the unionist government, and that crucially we would get full British rights. One has to stress again and again, we were not marching for a united Ireland. We were marching for the right to become full British citizens.
God save us all!
Well, as regards the 5th of October, rank and file police that I discussed that matter with felt that the police overreacted on that occasion. You know, this was a peaceful civil rights march, and okay, they were in breach of the order which banned them, but the consensus of opinion in the police, or any police that I spoke to about it, and most of these were Protestants, of course, said that was totally unnecessary, and showed us up in a very bad light.
I knew what was coming, and I also knew when people round the world got the sight of blood being spilt, demanding work, houses, and universal suffrage, that the genie would be out of the bottle, and the unionist system, as we knew it then, would come crashing down about their heads. And that's exactly what did happen.
I was a working class Protestant. That was my sort of social status, and that status led to my indignation, because when I was working in the city centre, I saw nationalists protesting to demand certain rights that I didn't have either. But it wasn't just that they were protesting about them. They were saying that I and people like me were denying them their rights when I didn't have them either.
January 1969. People's Democracy, a student-led civil rights group, set out on a march from Belfast to Derry to highlight inequalities across Northern Ireland. The organisers were aware that the march would be contentious and that it would be opposed by loyalist Protestants who saw it as an attack on the Northern Ireland state as a whole. At various points along the route, the marchers came under attack from loyalists, but it was at Burntollet Bridge, some 5 miles outside Derry City, that they came under the most serious assault. A loyalist crowd attacked the marchers while the Royal Ulster Constabulary and the B Specials, an auxiliary police force which had an infamous reputation amongst Catholics, looked on. The marchers arrived in Derry to a rapturous reception. But as news of the attack spread, rioting broke out in Derry city centre. In the early hours of the morning of the 5th of January, a group of RUC men entered the Bogside and proceeded to launch an attack on houses in the St Colum's Wells area, smashing windows and singing sectarian songs.
They were thumping their shields with their baton and they came marching down the hill. And what could we do? We all ran home.
Barricades were erected to keep the RUC out of the Bogside. It was on this night that John Caker Casey, a local resident, inscribed the legend, "You are now entering Free Derry," on the gable end of a house at the edge of the barricaded area. It was to be 5 days before the barricades were withdrawn and Free Derry was once more connected to the rest of the city. This was a decisive moment. Over the coming months, rioting intensified as nationalist youths determined to keep the RUC out of the area. The arguments of those prepared to condone the use of violence in the struggle for civil rights were to be significantly strengthened by the events of the 19th of April. As rioting against the police raged along William Street at the edge of the Bogside, a local resident, Sammy Devaney, had been watching the proceedings from his front doorstep.
Sammy Devaney was very well known in Derry, and he was very well known as a very fair person who was not really politically involved, as far as I know, with anybody or anything. Apparently what happened was that 3 or 4 young boys running away from the police ran in through Sammy's front door, ran through the house and escaped out over the back wall. And the police broke down the door, and I think 5 or 6 policemen went into the room and battered everybody in sight.
They beat her on the legs.
The assault on Devaney was carried out in front of his family. The following day, his daughter spoke out on national television about the attack. Her testimony sent shockwaves across Derry.
At all times, the only time they used their fists was on me, and one of them kicked my daddy in the corner of the room. One of the policemen. I didn't know it was my daddy at the time because the children were crying, and Freddie Budd, a neighbour, also came into the room before him, and he was on top of 2 of them, and I was on top of 2 of them.
What was to protect them?
To protect them, because we saw the police coming in the room. You know, once they'd kicked my daddy and we knew they would come in.
Well, I had never come across it before, and I don't think anybody else had either, where 5 or 6 policemen would break down someone's door and go in and severely hammer everybody in that house. I mean, as far as I can gather, there's no question asked. Anybody that was there got beaten, and that included the children.
They then kicked my daddy from the corner of the settee right up on the middle of the floor, and his head was lying on the mat, face up. And they walked out, and I knelt down at my daddy, and I was really just praying over him. I thought he was dead. You know, after the beating that he had taken, I thought he never could survive it.
The awful thing was that the policeman, the officer, with his rod of office, the blackthorn stick, that was his rod of authority, stood there tapping it on the floor while his men almost beat a man to death.
Devaney died on the 17th of July 1969, less than a month before thousands of Protestant apprentice boys were due to march in the city. He was 43 years old. There was no doubt in the Bogside that his death was a result of the RUC beating. For many in Derry, Sammy Devaney was the first victim of the Troubles.
The feeling in the town at the time was such that we all realised that there couldn't be an Apprentice Boys March that year, because if there were, there was going to be very serious violence in the town. The fact that Sammy Devaney died and was buried with a massive, massive, massive funeral, I think it was only a couple of weeks before it, was an added significant factor.
The Apprentice Boys Parade processes along Derry's walls directly above the Bogside, continuing on a circuit through the heart of Derry City, celebrating a Protestant victory in 1689, a major event in the Protestant calendar. In August 1969, fueled by the growing tensions in mainly Catholic Derry, conflict was widely predicted.
I think it was a very real prospect that a number of apprentice boys clubs from outside of the Derry area were very determined to attack Bogside. I have no doubt about that. I was receiving information from outside the city that some apprentice boys members were coming to the city in order to teach the Bogsiders a lesson. I'm not for one moment suggesting that the apprentice boys leadership were part and parcel of that, but it is a fact that there were a large number of apprentice boys from outside the city who were determined to attack the Bogside.
I think the fears were real, and as I recall them, the fears were much more real of the RUC than of the marchers. People in the Bogside were afraid of the police, and I think they were much more afraid of a police invasion under the cover of August than they were of a loyalist invasion.
It was in this climate of militancy that Sean Keenan, an IRA veteran and one of the few active Republicans in Derry, moved with fellow Republicans and other concerned nationalists to set up the Derry Citizens Defence Association. On the 30th of July, Sean Keenan took up the chairmanship and Paddy Doherty became his deputy, thus ensuring it was not seen as an exclusively Republican organisation.
Well, of course, one of the things that we had to do if we wanted to stop the trouble, that was to talk to the apprentice boys and see if they could put off the march. They had no bother about meeting us, absolutely none. We got very little joy from them that night. They said the die was cast, but they said they would have plenty of stewards there, and it would be up to us to steward our own people. They would steward their people. And on the way up to the meeting, Brother Stange, there had been a number of people who had tried to instill some concept of bringing about peace and stopping the rioting, and had written on big white letters, "Give peace a chance," on the way up to the Apprentice Boys Hall. After the meeting was over and we were coming down the same street, there were half a dozen boys with black paint painting out the scrawl on the road, and I said to Keenan, "We ain't going to stop the battle."
On the streets, the Defence Association organised themselves and provided equipment for the defence of the Bogside in the event of any incursions by Loyalists or the RUC. Street committees were formed and barricades organised to seal off the Bogside. Everybody was given a role in the defence of their areas. As the 12th of August approached, attempts were made to have the Apprentice Boys Parade banned.
The tension and the temperature, politically speaking, had been building for some time, as I recall. Unionists were looking upon it as their right to demonstrate and parade, which they felt was not being an aggressive or triumphalist manner at all, and they couldn't understand, we in the unionist community couldn't understand that it could be viewed in a radically different light by the nationalists, particularly when there was this expectation of trouble.
The situation about parades then was very much like the situation about parades is now. I mean, quite clearly, certain contentious parades can give rise to disorder. Also, banning certain contentious parades can give grounds for disorder. And, you know, one of the difficulties in all of this is that do you forbid people to parade because other people say, well, if you do that, you know, we will come along and pelt the police with stones or whatever. I think a distinction was made between the possibility of banning a kind of ad hoc parade, which was arranged on the spur of the moment, perhaps to make a very contentious political point. And, you know, the Apprentice Boys Parade, which, whether you liked it or not, and clearly a lot of people didn't like it at all, was essentially, you know, an annual event. So, had it been banned, what would have happened? We know what happened when it wasn't banned. What we don't know is what would have happened if it had been banned.
The Northern Ireland government made no moves to prevent the march, and Westminster, with ultimate authority over Northern Ireland, chose to maintain the official British policy of non-interference. With trouble seen as inevitable, Northern Irish Prime Minister James Chichester Clark had travelled to London on the 8th of August to communicate his concerns about the growing unrest and to seek permission to deploy the British Army in support of the RUC.
What came out of your meeting, Prime Minister, with the Home Secretary?
Full discussion of the whole situation and the various things that have been going on. Very useful discussion it was.
Do you still regard the situation as being very critical in Northern Ireland, Prime Minister?
Not critical, but I'm obviously not happy about the situation.
About the possibility of troops going into Ireland?
I said we discussed the whole field, and troops obviously is included.
Was that a special point, sir?
No, particularly.
What about the
The Northern Ireland government wanted to know if we would allow British troops to serve there under them, to which I gave the reply, which I will put quickly now, no, not unless you make changes in the way in which you govern the country. We can't allow British troops to be put in that position where they're responsible only to the Northern Ireland government and not to the British government.
On the morning of the 12th of August, thousands of apprentice boys and their supporters arrived in the city for their celebrations. A strong RUC force had been drafted into Derry in an attempt to prevent any outbreak of violence.
Well, prior to 68, 69, Apprentice Boys Parade went out relaxed, but because of the street violence that preceded August 69, there was a certain amount of apprehension going out, a certain amount of wondering what was going to happen. So you didn't go along just your carefree way.
That particular day, I happened to be one of the marshals on parade that day, and my marshalling area was Waterloo Place, and it was rather rough. But my job as a marshal was to keep the parade on the move, because we felt if the parade stopped at any time, then the violence would really explode.
I belong to Derry and I know that. At the same time, these men here have to keep their backs to you and watch them, you're not helping. So an appeal to you to go back.
I mean, it was groups of young people, 10, 15 at a time, you know, that start off initially going down to see what's happening in Waterloo Square, you know, what's happening in Waterloo Street, you know, and from there, you know, standing about for 10 minutes watching what was happening, then just getting bored with it. And I think, yeah, you know, there was quite a bit of taunting from the police. There was quite a bit of taunting from the march itself. And that actually led to the first stones and bottles being thrown. But, you know, as for a plan of when the march gets to Waterloo Square, everybody's going to attack it, you know, my experience is that wasn't the case.
I was there for most of the time trying to restrain our people, but it was very difficult. It had gone too far, and it was almost inevitable, and we didn't have enough stewards either.
But I mean, as we came very close to the edges of the Bogside, I mean, I can still see those stones being thrown from the William Street area. And I mean, it was from then on that we had a serious problem with the parade. We certainly had a situation where people were being hit with stones, and unfortunately, then there were some stones thrown back.
Or people then started throwing stones at the head of the police at the Apprentice Boys. They got offside, but then the two protagonists faced each other. the young people of the Bogside and the police. And there must have been every police that they could muster in Northern Ireland there, you know. And they hung back. To be fair to the police, I think they took the full rattle of the stones for about 2 hours before they moved. And there was a tumultuous cheer in the Bogside when the police got on their vehicles and made the charge into the Bogside.
And once the situation was reached where there were RUC people in William Street, in the Bogside, then it seemed to many Bogsiders that that was the start of it, that the attack on the Bogside had begun.
The police have just made their first baton charge. They're now inside the Bogside area. The crowds are pushing them back. There's been another fusillade of stones flying into the police. So far as standing their ground, but for the first time they've taken to throwing the stones back into the crowds.
Although many of the apprentice boys left the area, a number of young loyalists remained, seeking an opportunity to attack the nationalist Bogsiders, regarding them as a threat to the Unionist state.
Hundreds of people were watching this, and they realised that not only was our area being invaded by the police, but they were also being invaded by a significant number of militants who were being protected by the police. The atmosphere changed almost immediately.
The battle commenced and the police come round the corner, Roswell Street, Agro Corner. But this time it wasn't your usual few dozen young people. There were hundreds of people of all ages. Respectable citizenry with anger on their faces. I must stress all ages, and I knew then they're not going to win this.
The Derry Citizens Defence Association put their plans into action. A headquarters was rapidly established in the house of Paddy Doherty in the heart of the Bogside. Many local youths who were not involved with the Defence Association also made preparations for battle. If violence was to take place, then it would be extreme and uncompromising.
So I said to Sean Keenan, we had been trying to collect a little bit of money, you know, for the civil rights movement at the time, and I said, Sean, have we any money? He says, I think we have £87. I said, what a bloody way to start a war. So I took the £87 and I went outside, and there were two of our stewards were there. I said, go and buy petrol. And burn everything from here to the Strand Barracks and take out the Strand Barracks. That's the order.
The Bogside itself was actually a building site at this point. You know, so you didn't need to bring down lorry loads of bricks and rocks. You know, what slabs on the road that we hadn't already lifted, we could still lift and use.
Petrol was requisitioned and bottles secured from the local dairy so that petrol bombs could be manufactured in large numbers and taken to the front lines.
The petrol bomb consisted of a milk bottle in which you poured petrol, flour, sugar, and then you took a piece of cloth, dipped it in petrol, stuck it into the neck of the bottle, and that was the wick. The wicks weren't sticking on, the petrol bombs were useless. And my mother and the other woman on the street, all of whom had worked in shirt factories and had experience of assembly line management, took over the petrol bomb station down there. So the bottles came flowing through regularly. Because they were all used to cooking, the exact amount of ingredients were put in: petrol, sugar, flour, and they made very good wicks. And when I watched those women make those petrol bombs, I knew that the revolution had come.
Well, they issued a few rat guns that fired rubber bullets. But the one occasion that I saw them used, the gunners only had 10 rounds each or something, and when they were finished, that was it. And then what you did, in fact, I was ordered by superior officers to throw stones back at the rioters. You know, which is an awful thing for police to have to do.
Your object was to stop rioters encroaching on the commercial centre of the city. That was your duties. Don't let them into the centre of the cities. So you battened charged, you retreated, you battened charged, you retreated. You had to stand there and wait for them for the next charge to come from them. It was a very sad situation there that we were put into. But it wasn't the fault of the men on the ground. It was the fault of further up the command.
This is Londonderry. This is Londonderry on the day of the Apprentice Boys' March. The police are now a quarter of a mile inside the Bogside area. This here is Harvey Street. They've been moved in here after sustaining for some 2 hours a hail of stones from people on the Bogside side of the barricades.
Come back up here, boys. Come up here.
Well, my memory of it was that it actually started while I was at work. And remember going home from my work whenever the battle had effectively begun. And I'd actually walked through the ranks of policemen who were lined up on William Street. And then moved along myself to Roswell Street and observed what was happening. And I went home, changed my clothes, went back down again, and rioted like everybody else, threw stones and bottles and whatever petrol bombs were to hand.
We organised barricades. We briefed local people about where barricades should be, agreed with them. They were going to put up barricades wherever they liked, and there wasn't much we could do about it, but I'm trying to persuade them to be sensible and not, we didn't want 6 barricades in the one street. You know.
I suggested that the barricade was being built wrongly, and that it seemed to me that it would fall on the first wave of attack. That was an error of judgment on my part, because then I looked as if I knew what I was doing, and then I was surrounded by all these other young people who thought, right, she knows how to build barricades, which I really didn't, but I now had supporters.
That evening, the RUC became the first police force in the United Kingdom to use CS gas upon its civilian population. The gas was pumped into the Bogside in large quantities, causing widespread breathing and respiratory problems for the whole population, whether rioters or not. This presented an unexpected challenge for the volunteers manning the first aid stations which had sprung up around the Bogside to treat the injured.
The whole of Derry was kind of covered in this cloud of tear gas. We really were at a loss on what way to treat it, because we had really been taught basic first aid. We'd never been taught how to manage tear gas, which turned out to be CS gas.
I was amazed, because not only were their eyes inflamed and watery, but an awful lot of them couldn't even breathe. They weren't able to breathe to such an extent that several of them were carried in. I didn't know what we were dealing with at this time. And then we started getting another type of casualty. People who had actually been hit in the face with a CS gas canister. And they were very serious injuries.
By the next morning, the battle had taken a further turn, with a group of young rioters encamped on the roof of the high Roswell Flats at the mouth of the Bogside.
The high flats was wonderful, all the young people up there. But they needed ammunition. So you had to climb out stories, a bundle full of stones. And I was only 24. But it was hard bloody work. It was also boring. Why am I a navvy? So I decided to take my stand on top of the high flats, looking down the place, and I had a fear of heights, and I thought, this isn't really for me. And I threw one experimental stone, and I realised that the forward motion could topple me over the high flats. It was quite terrifying. And then I realised that if the police, by some chance, managed to capture the high flats, there was only one entrance, only one way up to the roof, and only one way out if they got onto that roof. I do remember thinking, God, they'd toss us over, they'd be that savage. So I got down off the roof very quickly.
Once they try to throw that, the top will come out and the petrol will go all over his back. That's why we've had people burned down there. So get the cork in very, very tight, as tight as you can.
Certainly it was the first time that I had been attacked from above. It was a very dangerous situation when you can't see anything, at least from the front. You can see it coming, but from above, you just cannot see these things coming.
It was like shooting fish in a barrel. All the young people were up on top of the high flats. The police were underneath. You just threw stones and petrol bulbs down at them.
At the same time, of course, we were being stoned heavily from the front, and the petrol bombs and missiles were coming down from the top of the Roosevelt Street flats. And then I was struck on my left shoulder by a petrol bomb, which enveloped me completely in flames. Things were somewhat a little hazy after that, but first thing I remember was the intense pain on my shoulder and the pain in my chest. I couldn't see. No matter where I turned, was flames all around me. I couldn't see where I was going. And as I ran into the rioters, someone hit me with something very hard, possibly an iron bar, down the side of the head, which smashed my helmet and put me out of action. Then I was taken from there to Gavin Hospital, where I was treated for my injuries, and was off ill for some 9 months after that.
It was not just petrol bombs and other missiles that were being used to carry the fight by the Bogsiders. As the battle progressed, they tuned into the crackling signal of Radio Free Derry, the pirate voice of the rioters.
Here BB, please play a request for William Brown from Helen.
This is Radio Free Derry broadcasting on 200 meters medium wave band.
The request is for Julie Willie and John McCourt from Bridget and Kathleen.
There wasn't an obvious leadership in the actual orchestration of the defence of the Bogside. There certainly were people who certainly had leadership qualities, and among them, I certainly would have put Bernadette Devlin. I would have put Eamon McCann. I suppose a few other names as well.
It would be very difficult to define or to categorise Bernadette's role during the Battle of the Bogside. She was on the spot. I mean, the main thing about Bernadette is that she was out there sort of with the people, young people on the streets. She was a very inspirational figure. She was a terrific speaker, of course, and all that, and spoke in a way which lots of people could understand readily. And one of her great qualities is that, I mean, she's a bit mad, Bernadette, I mean. She was telling people that CS gas is all right once you get used to it. And she would walk through it. And she was able at times. She was to walk through these clouds of CS gas, which she was a real cool lady, Bernadette, in 1969.
There was an impression that I was everywhere because, well, I suppose I was noticeable because I was me and I shouldn't maybe have been at it and I was a member of Parliament or whatever. But looking back on it, my memory was I never slept for 3 days and 3 nights. I was on an adrenaline high, I suppose. I was quite determined the police weren't coming in. The whole thing was as easily stopped as withdrawing the police. You couldn't withdraw the Bogside. It was a fixed entity. The people lived there. Any kind of wise head in the police would in fact have pulled the police back.
Well, the shields that we had were hopeless. They were quite small, and there was no such thing as body armour. We kept being hit in the ankles and legs by stones ricocheting off the ground and so on. And a lot of the men got cardboard that you would use for packing goods and that, and tie them around our legs like shin guards, and football shin guards, which saved us a bit.
We'd be throwing stones at the police. They would use their shields. And Bernadette stands, was up around the credit union about 1 in the morning, and Bernadette appears with her bullhorn And says to the police, I wish to address the rioters. They said, certainly. They think she's going to call for some kind of truth. And Bernadette stands in the middle ground and she turns her back to the police and she says to the rioters, I have noticed that you all throw your stones at the heads of the police, and the police raise their shields and you're not hitting them at all. Therefore I suggest you break into two groups. Half of you throw stones at their feet, their legs, the other half simultaneously throw stones at their head. That way we'll get this over with quickly. And with that I hear a roar, an elemental roar, and as the police who realise Bernadette's putting one over them, they come charging down the street, and there's just me and Bernadette. And how I did it, I don't know. There was a 6-foot wall leading into somebody's backyard. I climbed that wall, over the wall, into the backyard, took the lid off a bin, climbed in, pulled the lid over myself and sat there for a couple of hours. I'm a hero. I don't know what ever happened, Bernadette.
Wonder, DJ barricades are beautiful. The next request is for Mrs. Nora McDurdy, 44 Leaning Guards, from her wee loving and handsome husband, Joe 90.
I was more or less at the front line with the rest, rioting, and I remember that the ammunition, for want of a better word, in terms of stones and bottles and petrol bombs were being ferried up to us, and we were always very conscious that there were people back at what is now known as Free Derry Corner who were elderly, and at that stage our thoughts were people in their 50s and their 60s, but also people in their 70s and their 80s who were as much part of the operation as we were, people filling petrol bombs, people gathering stones and ammunition to be brought up to the front.
Maybe some people were scared, but on the whole, generally, I think people helped, especially there with tear gas and what have you. When that was thrown, people used to leave buckets of water outside the front door and all, and pieces of cloth for young lads to clear their eyes, and not only young lads, but older people too. Let's remember that in the Battle of the Bogside, that there was older people as well as the young. The young people were in the front line and top of Roswell's Flats and all the rest of it, but the older people were a backup, really.
It was a real community in action. Strange as it might seem, it was like one of those lads' battalion in the First World War, where everybody was, from the same streets or the same factories or something. Everybody knew one another.
The effect of the gas and the fear of violence on the streets saw many young children and elderly people evacuated from the area, some crossing the border to the Irish Republic and others to friends and family in different parts of the city.
The tear gas, which now pervades the whole of the Bogside area, is a good enough reason for leaving home. But these people now consider themselves to be full-blown refugees from a merciless enemy, and nothing will convince them that the Protestants, the police and the B specials aren't to be kept out of the Bogside area at all costs.
Why is it impossible for you to stay?
With the police and the B men and the Paisley lights, you'd have to get out. Or you'd burn you out.
All I remember is us being moved out of our home in Herd Street, the barricade being there. I remember my mother taking furniture and saying to my father, take this, take that, because we might not be able to come back again. We were taken into houses in Craigan and Chantal. We ended up in a house on Foy Road. And all the talk was that the house might be burnt down. That's all we were hearing. We weren't hearing anything else. It wasn't safe. We weren't safe in our own home, our environment. And it was pretty traumatic for us as a family to be moved like that.
I remember I never had a bag packed with all the necessities for him, with a new baby and for my other children ready to go, because so had all my neighbours, because we felt that, that we were going to be overwhelmed by the sheer force of the police and the B specials.
As fighting raged throughout the day, a press conference was held at which Paddy Doherty called for every able-bodied man in Ireland to travel to Derry to assist in the defence of the Bogside. That evening, Jack Lynch, the Prime Minister of the Republic of Ireland, made a dramatic intervention which increased the tension around the Bogside, raising the expectations of nationalists and confirming the worst fears of unionists.
Good evening. It is with deep sadness that you and I, Irishmen and women of goodwill, have learned of the tragic events which have been taking place in Derry and elsewhere.
I remember hearing it on the street when I heard it, word spread, and I was very confused by the time it spread. It was reported that Jack Lynch had said, that he would send troops in. There were reports that the Irish army was massing on the border at Nixon's Corner, just a couple of miles outside the city. There were numerous reports that the Irish army had crossed the border, and indeed, people giving eyewitness accounts or reporting the eyewitness accounts of other highly reliable witnesses that contingents of the Irish army were just outside, the city boundary on the Letterkenny Road. All nonsense, of course, but there was wild rumours flying around Legat.
It is clear also that the Irish government can no longer stand by and see innocent people injured and perhaps worse.
I was encouraged by it. I thought that it was, hey, this is tremendous. The Irish government are going to do something here. I had visions of, soldiers moving into Derry, representing the Irish government, and effectively assisting the citizens in repelling the activities of the British state. And I think that it became quite clear to us within a very short time that wasn't going to happen.
It is obvious that the RUC is no longer accepted as an impartial police force.
All of that fueled the fires of concern and anger and indignation in the unionist community, and led them to believe that the worst fears that they had about the last 6 or 8 months were all justified. The fact that it didn't actually materialise, that the Irish army came to the border and didn't come into Northern Ireland, at that point that was lost in the unionist community, because their view was the intent was there to invade.
Very many people have been injured, and some of them seriously. We know that many of these do not wish to be treated in 6 county hospitals. We have therefore directed the Irish Army authorities to have field hospitals established in County Donegal, adjacent to Derry, and at other points along the border.
We actually expect to see armed men, and then it became clear that what he actually was moving up was like first aid tents and stuff like that, and I think that they often misquoted as having said, will not stand idly by, but to all intents and purposes, with the exceptions of field hospitals, we felt, they did stand idly by. The song Jack Lynch, he had an army, had 10,000 men, he marched them up to the border and he marched them back again. And that's the way Jack Lynch's contribution to the Battle of the Bogside is remembered for me.
That night, word spread rapidly that St. Eugene's Catholic Cathedral was under attack. In fact, it was not directly targeted, but the effect was to bring even the most conservative Catholics out onto the street.
There was a few incidents where the rumour went round that the cathedral was going to be attacked. I think there had been some nonsense incidents, a bit of bravado by some loyalists. Of course, people who had never been out before all of a sudden come out, the men with their collars and ties on.
The doctors, the solicitors, people like that. Let us defend the cathedral. Really, they were looking for an excuse to come out, if you ask me. To come out and join in what was essentially sometimes great fun, and there were Jesuitical discussions with priests standing there. I'm sure everybody's told the story, Father Mulvey. There's a petrol station near the cathedral, and he stands there and he said, "You may take the petrol but not destroy the station." Thanks very much, Father. And they defended the cathedral and everybody joined in. Stupid police, stupid loyalists.
It was in the violence at Great James Street that the RUC fired shots into the nationalist crowd, injuring a small number of rioters.
We all wondered, where's it going to end if they started shooting at people protecting a church? How are we going to cope in the situation we're in? There was no possibility. We couldn't do it. And it was a very worrying time.
Having been faced with over 24 hours of large-scale violence, the RUC, ill-equipped and undermanned, were desperately overstretched. There was serious unease in Westminster.
Not only were the police tired, weren't even given proper conditions. The simplest things like making refreshments available for them, giving them shelter and giving them rest and so on. All the things that had been done in London only a few months earlier in Grosvenor Square and the riots that took place there, which solved the situation for us. The Northern Ireland government didn't seem to have the capacity to do it then.
We were too far away from our base at Victoria, you know, to be able to sort of relieve half a dozen men at a time to go back and have a bite to eat or something. So, I mean, from we went out at 9 o'clock, 9:15 or something, we left the station. We didn't have any dates at all.
I mean, at that time, we had a caravan at Benone, which is a seaside place about 25 miles from Derry, and we would have been there every weekend, but also for the whole period of the summer. But I do remember one night the caravan doors all being banged on, and the men of the families were asked to come to Derry, and I remember the phrase, "The police are being beaten into the ground, we need to go and support them." And what I do know is men were absent from Benone for several days, fathers and big brothers and stuff.
I do recall several occasions being down behind the police lines and the attacks going on. I remember some of the police officers being absolutely tired out. So when I was there, I was seeing all of this and seeing the frustration of many of the police officers, and some of them returning stones because they had very little else to respond to the rioters. But I, as a Protestant youth, felt that I was just there to try and shore up and help the police as they came under a continuing onslaught by Republicans.
We were getting regular reports about the situation from police sources. Of course, it's rather amusing that even governments, of course, very often heavily rely on the broadcasting media. But between police reports and broadcast reports, we were pretty well aware of a deteriorating situation.
As violence continued throughout the day, it was clear that there was chronic fatigue on all sides.
First day, everybody came in and there were head wounds, they were overcome with CS gas, and we brought them round and they went straight out again. They wouldn't even lie down for 5 minutes, they went straight out to the barricades again. Next day they came in, they lay down for a wee while, it got more reluctant to go out, they went out again, and by the third day when they came in they collapsed there, and we had barely a bed to put anybody on. They were lying on the floor and they were lying everywhere.
I remember on the third morning I came home to brush my teeth or something, and it was 8:30 in the morning, and rat-a-tat me father the walker. It's like, "How's the fight going?" "Very well, Daddy. I'm just home to brush my teeth." And he said, "God, I'm dying for my breakfast." I said, "I'll go up and waken my mammy." And I come up into this very bedroom. This is the marital bedroom. And there's my mother in the bed. And on one side of her is a priest. And on another side is a university professor. And they're all lying under the blankets. The men, albeit, were fully clothed. I went back downstairs, said to my Daddy, "The breakfast will be a bit late. My Mommy's sleeping with the priest and the professor." And he chuckled. I knew who the priest was and the professor. He was delighted. His wife could still handle the man. And they all come down for the breakfast. It was that kind of odd scene that you went and slept where you could.
Very, very quickly people, they fell in behind what was happening. They became a part of it, you know, and just as much as the guy down on the barricade throwing the stone was a part of the Battle of the Bogside, so was the wee woman sitting up at 3 o'clock in the morning making soup for him, you know.
The Bogside buzzed with reports that the much-feared B specials were appearing in different parts of the city. With renewed vigour, the rioters set about the defence of their area.
These are some of the defenders of Rossville Flats. They're masked and they've got their helmets on because they don't want to be recognised.
We hope for our Irish or British troops to come in to get that crowd RUC out.
That's a rabble, that's
this is what we want. We don't want no more RUC.
You want the troops in?
Yeah. We want our
troops. And you want to stay here and provoke the troops?
No. When troops come in, we'll stop fighting.
And I remember being with Johnny White, who at the time was the leader of the James Connolly Republican Club in Derry, and Johnny and myself were both at the in William Street, and I remember he was shouting to Johnny, have we guns, White? Because they would have assumed sort of that Johnny White, being a well-known Republican, would know whether there are guns or not. And Johnny being non-committal, I said to him, do we have guns, Johnny? And he shrugged his shoulders. It's just 3, he says, but 2 of them don't work.
In Westminster, Home Secretary James Callaghan realised that British intervention in Derry was unavoidable.
Chichester Clark, who was then the Prime Minister, found that the police were so dog-tired and so unable to continue that he came and said, look, we must have troops, and they accepted it, and they accepted them on our conditions. And the British government remained responsible for how the troops were deployed.
It's quite obvious that we were going to be overrun. So I think some of the officers on the ground must have pointed this out to headquarters people.
But on the critical day, I recall being at a meeting with the Prime Minister in his room up the hill at Parliament Building. So the Prime Minister had an office there. And Graham Shillington, who had been detached to Derry to command the forces there, in effect said to me, we can no longer contain our situation. My men are exhausted. We're having to fall back and essentially abandon the city to the rioters. And we could see very clearly that at that moment, the army had to be called in.
On the 14th of August 1969, the first officially deployed soldiers set foot on the streets of Derry. The Prince of Wales' own regiment were under orders to relieve the RUC, but to make no attempt to enter the Bogside or confront the rioters.
Quite frankly, we were all exhausted, so we were certainly glad to see them. Wished them luck on our way through.
As the RUC withdrew and the rioting stopped, there was an obvious and widespread relief as an uncertain peace was established.
Almost immediately, the weary police withdrew from their positions for arrest, and the B Specials, the part-time policemen so hated and feared by the Bogside Catholics, who had only just appeared in the Londonderry streets ready to do battle with the rioters, found themselves redundant. In that first hour, the tension was almost unbearable. What would the soldiers do next?
We come in to help the civil power restore order. What we want to do is give people time to settle down.
Were they here to reinforce the police? And I think that was one of my first fears, was that they were here to complete the job that the police couldn't defeat. Because remember, for almost 3 days, that's massive police force, armed, with armoured cars, couldn't subdue what was happening on the Bogside. Did the Northern Ireland government decide that it's going to be suppressed one way or the other? Did we won? That day we won. And that day I think we had a feeling that we won.
We were delighted. More delighted at seeing the RUC withdraw, because then I ran up Fawn Street and saw the police withdrawing. The soldiers there with their guns, holding them by the stock and the bar, pushing the police back. The police didn't want to go, and I started saying, get back, get back. I said, yes, get back.
I didn't see it as a defeat for the RUC. I saw it as a situation where the British Army were coming in more or less to back up the RUC. And I certainly didn't see it as a defeat.
Gentlemen, please. It is very important. Is there a superior officer in the area?
They were welcomed with open arms by the nationalists. Now that of itself then meant that many unionists said, well, if the nationalists are welcoming them and the police are being withdrawn, that can't be a good thing for the unionists.
I was in a minority of, a very small handful of people who, bearing Brenton Behan in mind, knew perfectly well that this human condition was about to be made infinitely worse.
The arrival of British troops marked the end of the battle. After 2.5 days of rioting, in which more than 1,000 people had been injured, A smouldering bogside, heavy with CS gas and littered with the rubble of the battle, was prepared to accept the army, in the short term at least. Although viewed as a victory by the Bogsiders, celebrations were muted. The barricades remained in place as Derry and Northern Ireland nervously awaited the wider response to the events that came to be known as the Battle of the Bogside.
I mean, you had the boys who wanted more activity, more action, more trouble, more shooting if they could get it. And there were those people who tried to bring some kind of sense of achievement into it and acceptance of responsibility. But there was no doubt in my mind that it wasn't the end of it. It was only the beginning.
Well, I think it's an absolutely enormous event, an event of massive historical significance, and one of the most important events to have occurred in the last century, because it did have a liberating effect on the people. It was an occasion where the forces of the state were effectively defeated by the heroism and the courage of just ordinary people on the streets.
We were not afraid